Melody Crispotted is here to represent Peace Over Violence. She is their Policy and Prevention Division Manager. Peace Over Violence is a nonprofit, multicultural, community-based, and volunteer-centered organization dedicated to building healthy relationships, families, and communities free from sexual, domestic, and interpersonal violence. To achieve this mission, the agency manages 5 departments delivering the services of emergency intervention, prevention, education, and advocacy. Peace Over Violence is dedicated to the elimination of sexual and domestic violence and all forms of interpersonal violence. They organize and they advocate. Not only do they believe, Peace Over Violence knows that violence is preventable. Melody, come on up.
Good afternoon, everybody. How y'all doing today? Good? Happy Halloween, everybody. So I'm here actually representing my executive director, Patty Giggins. In case anybody was expecting her, I'm obviously not her. You can tell because I'm twice her height. But I'm here to talk, hopefully, a little bit more positively, a little bit more optimistically about some of the prevention services that we provide through Peace Over Violence to try and build communities free from sexual and domestic violence before they get a chance to start. So as mentioned, we have 5 divisions at Peace Over Violence providing services to the community. We respond 24 hours a day, 7 days a week through our 24-hour hotline. We are a part of the city's sexual assault response team and domestic abuse response teams, which means that we have advocates, staff, and volunteers who respond to hospitals when survivors are getting their rape kit done. And we have advocates and volunteers who will respond with law enforcement when there are domestic violence cases so that we can provide on-site advocacy and support for those survivors. Our intervention services include case management, counseling, support groups, and we offer all of our services to anybody who's in need of them, whether they be women, children, men, the LGBTQ community, and all of our services are provided in English, in Spanish, and in American Sign Language for folks. I manage our prevention, education, and advocacy divisions at the agency, and we really follow a model believing that violence is preventable. We believe that if we can learn it, we can unlearn it. That violence is not healthy for people and other living things. If we can see it, we can stop it. And that silence is violence. So if we can talk about it, we can change it. And that's the philosophy that drives all of the work that we do through our prevention and education divisions at the agency. So we've been doing prevention of domestic violence and sexual assault for over 20 years now. We've had the privilege of doing this for one of the longest amounts of times in the country. POV was founded in 1971. We're one of the oldest domestic violence and sexual assault agencies in the country. And we were one of the first, like I said, to start doing prevention. And so this is a model of how we do prevention. This comes from actually the CDC. So in the 90s, the CDC finally decided maybe violence is a public health issue. Maybe violence is something that has an adverse effect on communities as a whole. And so when they decided to start looking into violence that way, they decided to use public health approaches to ending violence the same way that we might use public health approaches to ending smoking, to promoting car seat use, right? So when the CDC is doing prevention for different types of community public health issues, they use what's called the spectrum of prevention. And basically what this is telling us is if we really want to see community-wide change, if we want to see systemic change, we can't just work one-on-one with individuals. We can't just work trying to change laws. We can't just work in collaboratives. We actually have to do all of these things at the same time. And so our prevention programming is designed to fit along the spectrum of prevention that's provided here. So most of our violence prevention programs that we have at Peace Over Violence are focused within the school systems and within the educational institutions that exist within Los Angeles. So we have one office in Los Angeles in downtown, just a couple minutes away from here, and a second office in Pasadena where we do a lot of the work that we do. So why is it important that we do this work in schools? Well, for a few different reasons. One thing that we believe is that schools have a responsibility to keep students safe, right? They have a responsibility to give students the skills that they need to succeed in the classroom and in their lives. And being part of a healthy relationship, learning how to have a healthy relationship, learning to respect other people's boundaries, learning to communicate about consent, all of this is part of having a healthy life, right? It is all part of the development of a young person. So healthy relationships are really the foundation for safe schools and safe communities. What we also know is that students can't learn if they don't feel safe. So if students are growing up in homes where they're witnessing domestic violence or sexual assault, where there are guns in the home, or if they're experiencing violence on their campuses, they're not going to feel safe enough to learn. They're not going to be wanting to attend school. We've seen students who don't want to go to school because they're afraid of what's going to happen to mom at home if they leave her during the day. Or students whose rapist is in their AP English class with them, and they have to go to school every day and see that person. And so schools really have a responsibility to address these issues. Because what we know is that domestic violence, dating violence, sexual violence, and stalking, these are happening on campus. We know that about 1 in 10 high school students has been physically hurt by their partner while in school. And 1 in 5 students overall has experienced some form of dating violence. And we're talking middle school and high school students. So our services that we provide at Peace Over Violence through our prevention programming, we actually start with students as young as 6th grade in the classrooms. And the other thing is that we know that teens date, right? And if teens are dating, inevitably, these relationships are going to have the chance to be unhealthy, right? Because of modeling that's witnessed at home, because we don't talk about healthy relationships. We don't talk to young people about how to respect their partner, about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, and understanding healthy sexuality. And so if teens are dating and if these issues are happening, we really want to address it. The other thing that we know is that being able to be in a healthy relationship is part of fostering a positive school climate. So if we want to see attendance go up, if we want to see rates of bullying go down, if we want to see substance abuse going down, we have to promote overall positive school climates, which includes providing social emotional learning for students, which means we can't just talk to them about algebra. We can't just talk to them about Shakespeare. We have to talk to them about how to be a healthy, productive member of society. So we work primarily with the LA Unified School District, which is the second largest school district in the nation, just following New York City School District. There are over 1,000 schools, over 600,000 students, 45,000 teachers, 38,000 staff. And out of those students, over 180,000 are English language learners, and there are over 92 languages spoken by students within the district. LAUSD actually even has its own police force. So we have the LAPD, and then we have Los Angeles School Police Department. So when we talk about trying to implement institutional change within this district, it's a huge, huge challenge. So modeled after that spectrum of prevention that I showed you earlier, we've designed a comprehensive 4-pronged approach to trying to provide violence prevention strategies in schools. And this includes educating and working with students, engaging parents and community members, training faculty and staff, and working on district and state level policy to influence all of these factors. one thing that we see happening very often when we talk about violence prevention or prevention of any sort of public health issue is that there's a lot of focus on working with students, right? We want to get that education directly to them, right? We want to help them learn, build these skills, develop their leadership, and that's so important. That's a key part of what we do at the agency. But what we started to see after implementing in the classroom for so many years was that we were growing a population of students that were feeling empowered, that were feeling like they wanted to speak out against these issues, that were finally feeling like someone is identifying what's happening to me and giving it a name. So I'm going to go to my teacher or my principal or my counselor and tell them about what's happening. Well, we hadn't talked to the teachers. We hadn't talked to the principals. We hadn't talked to the counselors. And so we had students who were now, having that courage to speak up and not getting the supports that they need, right? What we would often see is, oh, that boy who sexually assaulted you, he's on the baseball team, and there's a scout coming out next week, and this is going to be really, really important for him. Are you sure that you want to make this report? Right. Well, have you thought about switching schools if you don't want to see him anymore, right? Teens shouldn't be dating anyways. So I think you need to talk to your parents about this, and they maybe need to discipline you a bit more, right? So talking to students wasn't enough. We needed to involve everybody on campus to make sure that they were part of the solution. So the tool that we use at Peace Over Violence is our violence prevention curriculum called In Touch with Teens. So this was a violence prevention curriculum that we originally developed in the mid-90s and then updated about 10 years ago now. So we're in the process of working on our third adaptation of it. But this is an 11-unit curriculum that empowers youth to have healthy relationships by promoting pro-social skills and talking to students about such issues as healthy sexuality, healthy relationships, and media literacy so that they can understand gender dynamics and violence, how it's presented. And what we spent a lot of time talking about, and I heard people mentioning earlier, is really focusing on empathy building and trauma-informed care and resiliency, right? So here's just an example of some of the units, or all of the units that are included in this curriculum, and you can see that it's very comprehensive, because as we just heard, these things don't exist in a vacuum, right? Domestic violence isn't over here, and sexual violence here, and stalking here. Oftentimes they're co-occurring. And so we take students through understanding the roots of violence and where does violence come from, to recognizing warning signs of abusive relationships, learning how to break those cycles of violence, recognizing sexual assault and sexual harassment, and being able to analyze media critically so that they can see how media influences how violence might occur or how we interpret gender and presentation and relationships. But what we also want to do is make sure that anytime we're taking something away from young people and saying, don't do this or this isn't okay, is give them the tools to replace it. So we also emphasize talking about healthy relationships, healthy sexuality, and understanding consent, and really giving students the tools to learn how to be a peacemaker. And so how can they learn to educate others, to be peer counselors, to mobilize and organize their schools and communities in order to make some changes. So I just want to give a couple of examples of how we do this across our spectrum. So our work with students, like I mentioned, very much revolves around our In Touch with Teens curriculum. We also focus a lot on youth leadership development. So there's pictured here a group of students from Franklin High School, which is a school in Northeast Los Angeles, and they are members of the STOP Club, or Students Together Organizing Peace. And they organize activities on their campus to promote healthy relationships and talk about violence as it impacts their community. These clubs exist at all different schools around the district, and each school kind of takes it on their own and runs it the way that they want to. So for example, at Franklin High School, the president of the STOP Club actually happened to also be on the football team. So half of our STOP Club was made up of male football players from the school. which made a huge, huge impact because those young men were seen as leaders on campus. So a couple of years ago when the Ray Rice incident happened in the NFL with domestic violence, we actually had a joint rally at the school where the Stop Club and the football team, decked out in all of their gear, were spreading awareness about healthy relationships and speaking out against a sports culture that promotes toxic masculinity and gender roles that lead to violence. So really trying to empower, they're amazing. Actually, that young man went on to get the Gates Millennium Scholarship based on the work that he did, and continues organizing around sexual assault prevention in his college at UC Davis. Look out for him to be president one day, I'm pretty convinced. We also have a 5-week summer institute that we run. So over the summer, we recruit about 30 students from across Los Angeles and the San Gabriel Valley to participate in an intensive 5-week program where students learn in depth about violence prevention strategies, community organizing, policy advocacy, and then they design their own internship projects to use those skills and take it out in their community. So we've had young people who organized going out and engaging with the homeless community and providing them with hotline numbers for sexual assault and domestic violence because of the overlap between those two issues. We've had students who put together open mic nights to invite people to come and perform spoken word poetry about violence prevention. We've been really lucky to work with the LA Kings, the NHL team, on this and have the influence of that team where, again, we can talk about healthy male role models. We are able, like I said, to take 30 students for that program. Last year we had 130 applications from students around the city wanting to be a part of this program. So it's highly competitive, but we're very intentional that this leadership program is not just for A students. We actually take very few A students. What we really want to do is try and recruit students with leadership skills that are maybe going unseen. Students who maybe have spent time being incarcerated, students who have a history of being trafficked, students who have been gang involved in the past, but who are in a setting along with those A students, along with younger college students, along with 14-year-olds, where they can learn from each other's experience and see, yeah, there are a lot of differences, but there are a lot of similarities among us as well. So this is just an example from the curriculum of one of the activities that we do. So you might be familiar with the power and control wheel. When we talk about domestic violence, well, we talk to the young people about that too. We talk to them about what does isolation mean? What does isolation look like? What does it mean for someone to use their social status to try and control you? We also talk to them, like I said, about healthy relationships. So here's an example of an activity what we do where the students create their own healthy relationship bill of rights, where they decide, this is what I deserve in my relationship, and this is how I deserve to be treated. And we encourage them to think about this in their relationships or when they are planning on dating in the future. And then my favorite unit that I wanted to highlight, just because it gives us the ability to talk about issues like gun violence, is Unit 1, which talks to us about the roots of violence and where does it come from. So you can see some of the objectives and the basics of the unit here, but really what we want to do is start opening the youth's minds to understanding things like oppression and privilege and how those big systemic macro types of violence influence the individual violence that we experience in our homes and in our communities. And one of the tools that we use is this activity, the Roots of Violence tree. So what we might do here is label this tree domestic violence or violence against women. On the branches, we have the students identify, well, what are specific examples of violence against women, right? What are things that you see? The trunk represents the different institutions that promote these ideas. So the media, our government and laws, the education system, culture, religion, so that they can see just where is it that we pick up some of these ideas. And then the roots of the tree represent the different types of oppression, or like we talk to the students, we call them the isms. So racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism. So we're teaching 11, 12, 13, 15, 16-year-olds these words so that they can begin to identify them. And when we do these trees, and we do one for violence against women, and we do one for violence against the LGBTQ community, and we do one for police brutality, well, guess what we see? The roots of all of these trees are the same. And part of why we do this activity with students is because sometimes, just like we all know, we interact with people who say, well, domestic violence doesn't impact me. Right? Sexual assault doesn't impact me. I've never met anybody who's been affected by that. It doesn't have an effect on me. But when we show them, maybe you haven't experienced domestic violence or sexual violence. Maybe you've experienced racism. Maybe you've experienced homophobia. Well, guess what? Those are coming from the same places. So if you want to work on eliminating one type of violence, we can actually work on eliminating all types of violence at one time. And we really highlighted that this year with our domestic violence campaign. I'm sorry if the image is a little bit light, but October we're just on the last day of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. As part of our campaign this year, we really wanted to show at Peace Over Violence that domestic violence is a root cause of so many other types of violence. And if we look at domestic violence, we can see how it helps impact domestic terrorism, gang violence, homelessness, mental health, everything we've been discussing here today. And so again, just grounding young people in this idea that violence impacts everybody, right? And we all have a responsibility to do something about it. We do a lot of work, like I mentioned, with parents in the community. So we go to parent centers at different schools. We have a parent leadership group that works on policy advocacy for students, and we try and make it as culturally relevant to the community as possible. So one of the images up here is from our annual Dia de los Muertos event that we have at POV. So, just geographically where we are, a high percentage of the community who we work with are immigrants, are Spanish speakers, whether that be bilingual or monolingual. So when we were trying to engage with parents and engage with community members about how could we talk about domestic violence in a way that felt safe, an idea that came up was to have a Day of the Dead event. So I don't know, is there anybody here not familiar with Dia de los Muertos or Day of the Dead? Everybody has kind of an idea of what it is. So it's traditionally a Hispanic Latino holiday from Central America where you honor the dead and also honor the living and celebrate those things. And you have altars dedicated to those you love who have passed. Well, what our parents decided they wanted to do was they wanted to build an altar for anyone who had passed because of domestic violence. And so now, because of how the timing works, Day of the Dead is November 2nd. We tie in every year our Day of the Dead event with the close of Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and we have teachers and parents and students put together these altars and put together a community event to invite people to come in and have a conversation about domestic violence in a way that feels safe and friendly and fun. So if anybody's interested, we actually have our Day of the Dead event this Thursday at Miguel Contreras High School here in Los Angeles at 5 p.m.
And the Day of the Dead is the 1st and the 2nd.
Yes, and yeah.
Children that passed away is November 1st.
Right.
November 2nd is for everybody else.
Yes, so we're having ours this year on Thursday, November 2nd. But thank you for that. As I mentioned, we also work with faculty and staff, providing trainings to them. So these are just some of the teachers, school police officers who we've worked with, who have been huge advocates for us. We know that teachers want to help, right? They want to be able to support students. They want to be able to give students the best opportunity that they can to learn. But often we don't prepare them with the right tools that they need in order to do it, right? And some of these teachers are so overwhelmed by what's going on with their students that, like I said, they just don't have the skills that they need in order to support students once they've been impacted by domestic violence, dating violence, or sexual violence. So what I always try and say to teachers when I want to come in and do a training with them is like, listen, I'm not trying to make your job harder. I'm not trying to load you with another thing that you have to learn. You're already doing this work. I just want to make it easier for you. And part of how we wanted to do that is to implement district policies. So as of now, there are very, very few schools around the entire country that have any sort of response policy as to what the protocol should be if dating violence happens amongst students, particularly if it happens on campus. And what we know is that this is something that happens. We actually just in LAUSD had a young woman who was killed on campus by her boyfriend. And teachers knew about it, the principal knew about it, there was a restraining order out on the young man, and no one did anything. Because there was no protocol to tell them what to do. So we've been trying to work with the district on policy so that there's something in place so that we're tracking how often this is happening, and we're making sure that we're providing students with the resources that they need. And not just resources for the student who's being victimized, but resources for the student using violence. Because as was mentioned earlier, we know that oftentimes people who perpetrate violence have histories of violence themselves, especially when it's young people. So these are just some of the components of the policy that we've been working on and trying to implement within LAUSD. We want a prevention coordinator, kind of like a Title IX coordinator, right? Someone who holds that knowledge about violence prevention. We want there to be someone on campus. We want education for students, everything kind of that we were talking about, but really also just looking at how can we monitor these incidences happening. So we actually were able to pass a resolution within LAUSD. Unanimously, they were very, very proud of themselves. That was in 2011, a month after that young woman was killed, who I mentioned. We have yet to fund this policy. And I don't know if you know anything about policy, but if there's no money attached, it basically doesn't exist. So a key component of my job right now is trying to advocate for the school district to actually fund and implement this policy so that it's not just sitting there and we're actually making use of it. So that's everything I have for you today. If you have any questions, let me know.
Quick question. So you're the first person, I've been to several conferences here with regards to crime and gun violence. And you are the first person who's actually used the ACE study and trauma-informed care in any of the conversations that have gone on. So can you talk a little bit more about how you use the ACE study and how you really provide the tools to the faculty
Sure.
to identify trauma and to really be able to help the students and the families with trauma-informed care?
Yeah, sure.
Because it also goes beyond that into the world of, you know, the physicians and the hospitals and all
Absolutely. So two things come to mind when I think about that. So one is we do go into the professional development settings or the counseling trainings, crisis counselors, and we have created presentations specifically around trauma-informed care. So we talk about the impact of trauma on young minds. We talk about adolescent development and how adolescent development is really changed when there's trauma present. And then we talk about like strategies just for, say, like classroom management, right? Because unfortunately we know that especially in urban environments, most students have been impacted by some kind of trauma. So whether that's domestic violence, sexual violence, or what, we have traumatized students. And so we take time and we work with principals so that we can provide that training on a regular basis. And so what we do is we actually get grants, whether that's private, city, state, or federal, to work directly with schools and with principals. So they sign memorandums of understanding and contracts with us saying, yes, you're going to come into our schools and we're guaranteeing that you're going to be able to train our teachers on this. The other thing that we use is that LAUSD has a network of wellness centers. So these are health centers that are actually located on school campuses. And we've worked with the physicians and the mental health providers at the wellness centers to help them with their intake process, to really see what kind of screening are you doing, and are you looking at ACEs, are you looking at trauma, and are you trying to find out whether these students have a history of dating abuse, either perpetration or victimization.
Suzanne. Oh, do you have one? Oh, go.
Thank you. A wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. I felt that most of it was directed toward on high schools or middle school, and maybe that's what you're only interested in. But I'm interested in elementary school children, and I wondered what you might be doing in that area to start developing healthy relationships, and most importantly, what about children who live in homes where there's abuse, and how we can reach them and help them, because they may not even want to talk about it.
Sure. So that's a really great question. We are currently not working in any elementary schools, and I will tell you that that's purely because, we walk in with our curriculum, and just to be honest with you, they see, you want to talk to our kids about sexual violence and domestic violence? You know that these are 9 and 8-year-olds, right? And so there's just this fear of are we talking about sex, right? Which we're not. We use age-appropriate language and activities, and we can talk to young kids about consent in a safe way without talking about sex, right? But there's been a barrier with people being afraid. Well, why do you want to talk to little kids about relationships? Are you promoting dating on this school, right? Are you promoting our kids having sex? Seriously, these are the things that I hear. Even in the middle schools and high schools, we have high schools that tell us our kids don't date, so I really don't think we need to talk about sex, right? You laugh because, right, we all know that kids are dating, right? So it's been a struggle. What we have done is work with parent groups at the elementary schools. So sometimes the schools will let us come into the parent center and give healthy relationship education or workshops to the parents. But we're trying to work on more advocacy to get into the elementary schools now. We do, though, provide support groups at Peace Over Violence for children who witness domestic violence. So, and that's for children of any age. Yes.
So Melody, great presentation. Three comments. One, I'm going to invite you to the monthly counselors meeting for the San Fernando Valley counselors.
Excellent.
A suggestion, I don't know if it's possible to implement this or put this into a section of the health curriculum in the 9th grade.
Yeah.
And the third and most important comment I have is to train the Department of Children and Family Services, because when we make the phone calls, the advice that we get, it's just not there, and it's critical because we're mandated reporters.
Right. Yeah, that's been a struggle with us as well, working with them. And again, I mentioned the fact that LAUSD has its own school police department because of how complicated it can make things. I can't tell you how many rooms I've been in trying to talk about policy and response and what do you do, who do you report to, and I'm in the room with DCFS, with LA School Police, with LAPD, and I say, so which of you would respond out if I told you that a boyfriend hit his girlfriend? And they all point like this to the other person.
There's no protocol.
There's no protocol, right? All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Melody. All right, we are